Hey, Robert.
Hey, Yaron.
So another boring week in financial markets, huh?
Yeah, hardly anything happens these days.
So we talked about the UK bond situation, and today Liz Truss, the Prime Minister of the UK, resigned under pressure after backtracking from everything she proposed. She gave it all back, and now she's resigned. So that's all in turmoil now because who knows who they're going to elect. But we were talking the other day, and remembering the bond vigilantes of the 1990s, and it feels like they're back, at least in the UK. So what were the bond vigilantes? Let's do a little bit of history first.
Well, the first sort of batch of deficits happened early in the Reagan years when
Yep.
they started trying to cut taxes, and of course the economy was terrible, and so there was a fear that we were going to have these unsustainable deficits, and then growth picked up and deficits shrank, and then tax reform happened and deficits shrank, and then the economy slowed in the recession of the early 90s, and the deficits came back. And when I say deficits, I mean, we've been running a deficit for a long, long time, but the deficit relative to the total size of the US economy, it's kind of sort of like your credit card balance. If your credit card balance is $1,000 when you're a college student, that might be a real problem. Because you have very little income. But when you're an adult with a career, $1,000 is just normal, or even 10 times that, because that's just sort of your normal spending. You pay it off. And so the way that that the term bond vigilantes came about was during the Clinton years, because when Clinton was elected, George H. Bush lost his reelection bid, probably because of the recession that had just happened. And so Clinton inherited an economy that was coming out of recession, and recent deficits were relatively high. Interest rates were higher than they are today. The idea that rates today are super high would be laughable.
Significantly higher than they are.
Much higher. Getting a 7% mortgage back in the 90s would have been a dream. And it did happen, but it was very brief. It was the exception, not the rule, on the other side. So Clinton had aspirations. He was the first Democratic president since Jimmy Carter, and he wanted to basically do Obamacare, a version of Obamacare. People called it Hillary Care because his wife was leading that effort, and it completely blew up. And part of it was because of Republican resistance. Part of it was because those things just haven't been popular when they've been proposed, even Obamacare, with the general public. But a lot of it was because the interest rates on Treasury bills, Treasury notes, and Treasury bonds would respond very quickly to a perceived change in macroeconomic policy. So if you're going to take over the healthcare sector, which is a huge sector, and we all know the government always comes in under budget and on time, and so it was viewed as potentially a disaster for the federal government's finances, and interest rates would shoot up, and then they would roll back, and interest rates would come down, and interest rates would be at today you think is a high level, but we're at more acceptable levels. And then they proposed something else, and interest rates would shoot up. And so Clinton felt very constrained, almost handcuffed by the reaction of financial markets. And we've had zero interest rates for a long time in the US, but that was true in UK as well. We haven't had any discipline by financial markets for a long time. And the way that it was characterized were that if you got out of line as a politician, the bond vigilantes would ride in and they would slap you down by interest rates going up.
And in a sense, the first vigilante was the currency vigilantes. I mean, they were very active, and they crushed the UK pound. I think it went. That's when it first got its big decline. Was when George Soros made his name for himself by betting against the pound and driving it low. And then, of course, the Asian financial crisis was all about, in a sense, the financial markets saying, you can't fix your currencies at these rates. Your currencies are not worth anywhere close to these values. And basically they were shorting the currencies. And that brought about the 1998 financial crisis. At that period, that whole period during the 90s, it seemed financial markets were actively disciplining politicians, whether it was on the currency side, primarily in third world countries or in developing countries, and then of course in the bond market in the U.S. to the point where George Carville is that what did he say? He said if he was James Carville, if he was reborn, he wanted to be reborn as the bond, as the bond market, because they were more powerful than God. And it seemed that there, and it'd be interesting. We can talk about why it went away, but it actually achieved. I mean, one of the things that it achieved, because I don't think this is anything that Clinton necessarily wanted, was that by the end of his term, there were actually budget surpluses. Now, part of that is because of Gingrich and the Republicans, but certainly part of it is because of this discipline that financial markets enacted on the administration.
Absolutely. And, the twin, so the US doesn't get disciplined by currency. I mean, the dollar does fluctuate, but it's not as painful for us. But the twin sources of discipline, currency and interest rates, you sort of have to pick your poison if you're a government, because if you try and fix a currency, then your rates go nuts. And if you try and fix your rates, then your currency goes nuts. And that's exactly what discipline is, you can't get around it. And it wasn't viewed as being something historically, for the US, it wasn't viewed as being something that constrained the federal government. And it was really interesting to see at the time Gingrich and the Republicans in Congress and Clinton sort of negotiate. It was almost like a dance, because there were definitely political points to be won for swinging what had been a long-term concern about the deficit into a surplus.
Mm-hmm.
And so there was a lot of, and I think a lot of it was politics, but some of it I think was really believing that it was better for the federal government to run surpluses during good times and then deficits during bad times than to always run a deficit. And you saw this sort of bipartisanship, and everyone was getting props. So I don't think Clinton started out as president wanting to be remembered for his economic policies and his success at reining in the deficit. But once it started to happen, why not, lead with your strength.
And of course, as soon as Republicans won the White House, and Senate,
it all went to hell.
Back through the roof.
And part of it was the end of the tech bubble. The tech bubble helped create the surpluses, but still,
Clinton benefited
exactly
from those capital gains, from the capital gains taxes from the tech bubble. So in the last 20 years, really, certainly since the financial crisis, the last 12 years, it doesn't seem like financial markets have acted as a disciplining mechanism. And, I assume much of that has to do, or most of it has to do with the fact that the bond market is being manipulated by the Fed. That is, the Fed has been an active participant, not just determining, as it always does, short-term rates, but actually determining the entire yield structure, at least influencing the entire yield structure.
Well, I think it all started with what people call the Greenspan put, where Alan Greenspan seemed willing to step into the market in the same way that the Bank of England did when gilts started going nuts, to provide some stability, provide a buyer of last resort in times where it was viewed to be a failure of the market structure rather than the actual economic pressures. Yep. But of course, if you get the idea that the Fed is going to bail you out anytime that markets go down, then you behave very differently than if you are worried about markets dropping a lot. Now, I think this has been way oversold, because certainly the Fed did not stop the market from going down in 2008 and 2009. You can argue the Fed made mistakes, but the reality is we had a big drop in 2000, from early 2000 through 2001, through 9/11 into 2002 in the market. We had another big drop in the late 20s. But that idea that the market isn't disciplining the Fed or Washington, but instead they are supporting it. It's a really twisted and toxic way to look at things. It's like we often see with regulators and the companies that they regulate, that the regulators end up working for the to the benefit of the companies, and the companies end up supporting the regulators in ways that don't accomplish the original goals.
Yeah, and of course, something shifted in 08, 09, because they certainly tried to support the market, but it was beyond, I think, their means. But something shifted in that they started buying bonds on a scale that nobody had ever seen, and not just treasuries. We were talking about mortgage rates earlier, and mortgage rates are right now 20-year highs or something like that. And the two aspects of that: one is the 10 years high, but the other aspect is the Fed's not buying mortgage-backed securities anymore. It's been buying them for 12 years.
Yeah, the put in excuse me, the put in the bond markets has been that the Fed was an active and massive buyer. And this is true in central banks around the world.
Yep.
And so the movement really went from that the Fed would cut interest rates in order to support the stock market, which I don't think was ever exactly true.
Yeah.
It was, the Fed would cut rates to offset financial shocks, and the stock market could be one of those financial shocks. But the Fed was very clearly stepping in both after the financial crisis, but even more so, like by a factor of 5, after COVID started.
Yep.
And that may have been the right thing to do, but it has consequences. If it were a free lunch, we would just do it all the time. Yep. So the fact that the Fed would come in anytime that interest rates went up, and the Bank of Japan is still doing this, that makes bonds and mortgages and any fixed income securities a very different investment than without that sort of put.
So you mentioned the Bank of Japan, and you mentioned interest rates and currency earlier, and I was noticing that today the yen reached 150 yen to the dollar, which I don't think it's ever been that high in terms of that cheap. I thought I was getting a deal when I was in Japan, and it was 144. I should have waited.
Exactly. Well, that's because the Bank of Japan is committed to zero
Low
interest rates,
Yep.
and they're the only.
Well, they have no inflation. The one thing is that they don't have any inflation. So real rates, I don't know if real rates are that different in Japan than here, but it doesn't seem like people care as much about real rates. I don't quite understand what's going on in the interest rate world. Because we're still, our 10-year is still negative, right? We're still under inflation. All of our entire yield structure, yield curve is below inflation rate. So we're still running negative interest rates. Japan is running negative interest rates, I think, but they strike me as smaller. So
I don't know, but it's inflation, ends up showing up both in the currency and in the nominal rate. So I think it washes out when you're talking about the two of those together. And it's just a great illustration of the point that you can have one or the other, but you can't have both. And what Japan is chosen is low interest rates and a weak currency. What the US has chosen is higher interest rates and a strong currency.
Yes, I'm surprised at how strong the currency is, given that interest rates are not even higher in the US. That's my only point. You'd expect interest rates, given the currency strength, I'd expect interest rates to be closer to the rate of inflation, and they're not. But
I think
it's markets.
And I think that there's definitely the dollar is a unique example, and you can't draw conclusions for other currencies.
Yes, I agree.
When you have a war going on and shit like that.
It's a rush to safety and on top of everything else, because people are worried about macro stability. I mean, the Prime Minister of England keeps resigning as an example of that, but and the dollar is something they run to whenever there's this kind of instability. It's interesting. Gold is not up. None of the things that we usually associated with these things are, and crypto certainly is not up. Right. But the dollar is, which is.
Well, but see, dollars, you can get those higher rates. You don't get
Yeah,
them in
yeah.
crypto. You don't, I mean, you
That's
get them promised to you and then you lose all your money in crypto. And you don't get it in gold.
Honest,
There's, again, that's the dollar is unique
Yeah.
in terms of the ability to buy treasury bills. If you had to hold it in cash, totally understand. It would be the exact same thing.
So let's talk a little bit about economic policy from the perspective of Ingenuism, and from in the context of like Liz Truss and what happened in England. So she came in fresh. She's a generally a free market leaning person. She thought, okay, what am I going to do? I'm going to cut taxes and I'm going to increase spending, which is a little bizarre. But the increased spending was almost all energy related, so it was almost all kind of politically necessary. I don't know that you could get away with not doing something like that in Europe right now. Every country's doing it. Cutting taxes, and of course, the market flipped out because of potential deficits and because so interest rates shot up, and that created kind of a financial crisis. We won't get into the technicalities, but what else? What other levers do the politicians have to improve an economy or to improve the growth rate? And ultimately, she said when she came in, she was going to be the prime minister for growth. She wanted economic growth, other than taxes, which it seems like the easy thing for them to do. Republicans do that every single time they get in. They cut taxes, and then what? Nothing much. But what else?
Well, this is how all of what's going on really relates to Ingenuism, because if you wanted to know what's an effective macroeconomic policy, you'd be very excited about the bond vigilantes being back, because now you're getting immediate feedback as opposed to having to wait to see how growth turns out to be for the next decade. And if you were not doing things randomly, but trying to design them based on what you knew, you might, especially if you're Liz Truss, look back at Reagan, and of course an analog in Britain at the time was Thatcher, and who had really successful, from an economic standpoint, really successful careers. They turned the US and the UK economies in a different direction. The trajectory had been bad, and then suddenly it wasn't bad. Now people argue terrible things, and that's fine. It's not true, and it wasn't like hell and then heaven, but there was definitely a massive shift in a trajectory from where things had seemed to be continually getting worse to things getting better. And if you look at the Reagan model, and I don't know as much about the Thatcher model, although I suspect it was very similar, I just don't know if they had the same increase in defense spending. So Reagan's idea was, we're going to cut taxes, we're going to continue the deregulation that started under Jimmy Carter, we're going to stand tough against adding new burdens to the economy, and we're going to increase military spending, not because we want to stimulate the economy or do anything, but because we have to deal with the Soviet Union. That needs to be handled. And so that's why deficits popped up. And if I'm looking back and I go, okay, well, I can either go try and do a Clinton, or I can try to do a Reagan. And I'm Liz Truss, I probably try to do a Reagan. And that's sort of what it looked like. Now, just getting rid of the top tax rate, as opposed to, massively broadening and lowering tax rates across the board, spending a bunch of money on energy subsidies versus building, more of a industrial infrastructure that has technological spin-offs. It doesn't look quite as good a plan, but it's fast, and I could see why she thought it would work. I'm certainly surprised at how quickly it crashed and burned, but that's really useful information, because it's not random. It's not like a bunch of left-leaning Twitter folks condemned it and then it crashed. It's because people who are trading literally trillions of dollars worth of financial instruments around the globe looked at it and said, you know what, this is not going to do what you think it's going to do, or you say you want it to do.
Or maybe it will in the long run, but in the short run, interest rates are going way up, and that's a problem for us.
It's a question is, why do interest rates go way up? It definitely was a problem. I think it was a strong signal about the long term. Now, it doesn't mean it's right. It just means if you were handicapping the success of that particular plan, and you wouldn't know the reality for a decade, I personally might have gone into it thinking, oh, well, 60-40, this will actually work well.
Yeah.
And then immediately, given the financial markets response, I'm apt to look at it and say, 70-30, it's not going to go well. And it's because the Bank of England wasn't involved. If the Bank of England were involved in buying all the gilts, I would have thought, okay, this is just more nonsense. And the fact that they had to step back in to keep the markets from blowing up, that was a strong signal for me.
So Thatcher actually, as far as I remember, didn't really cut taxes. But what she did is she completely restructured the British economy. I mean, she massively deregulated and privatized. So Britain, of course, was much more socialist.
Yeah, you should explain what that means, because nobody in the U.S. understands that.
So in Britain, the means of production were owned by the state. The railroads were owned by the state. Much of a bunch of industries were owned by the state. I mean, literally, this was socialism in the sense that the means of production owned by and run by, and that had failed. And the UK was much more socialist in that sense than the US ever was, and it had suffered much more. I mean, the UK economy in the early mid 70s was a disaster. It was complete utter disaster. And she came in, she privatized. She sold the railroad. She sold, and then she broke the unions, which is similar to what Reagan did. I mean, Reagan also fought the unions and
it was the flight.
That sent a signal. He did it once. All you have to do sometimes is
was
once.
The stake in the ground. Yeah.
Yeah. And with her, it was the mining unions, and to this day, the Brits. I mean, funnily enough, most Brits don't like Margaret Thatcher, in spite of the fact that she completely changed their world for the better. They have no appreciation for that. But she spent a lot of time, and a lot of what she did was step back from markets and allow markets to function, allow kind of the Ingenuism process to happen. The beauty of, in a sense, deregulating is not that now there are no controls in the market, in the sense that there are maybe no government controls, but you let now the market establish its own levels and its own controls, and allow for kind of ingenuity and entrepreneurship. And Britain came back. It came back in the sense of entrepreneurs. It came back in new businesses, and of course it became a financial center, which I think is all kind of built around this. Once you open up the space, people innovate and figure out where your comparative advantage is globally, and where you can contribute the most. And I think that process happened in the 1980s in England, and it happened in the 1980s in the US. I mean, in the US, one of the things that happened because of deregulation, financial markets, all that was the shutdown of, what did they call it? The Rust Belt, in a sense, the transfer of capital from the Rust Belt to Silicon Valley, which is maybe one of the most underappreciated stories of that period. I mean, yes, a lot of people lost their jobs in the Rust Belt, and there was a lot of pain, but net the economy added jobs, and most of those jobs were better jobs in places like technology.
Yeah, would you rather have Toyota, or would you rather have Tesla, or would you rather have Toyota, or would you rather have Apple?
Yeah,
and that's not a distinct choice. Like, nobody is making those kind of choices from on high, but that is the result that comes out of protecting what exists versus allowing things to fail, people to learn, and new stuff to emerge. And I think you make a really important point, which is that things were very different in Thatcher's Great Britain than Reagan's America, because they were at different places. And what both of them did was to go after the low-hanging fruit.
Mm-hmm.
And it doesn't, and in fact, I talked about tax reform with Reagan, but tax reform didn't happen until 1986. He was elected in
it was late.
In 80, he became president in 81. So it was his second term. He was a lame duck president when he did tax reform, which is sort of amazing if you think about it. But the low-hanging fruit of allowing Ingenuism, allowing markets, allowing really people to figure stuff out, you can't overstate it. That really is what drove both successes. And so if you were Liz Truss and you were looking at it like, okay, mechanically, I need to cut taxes here, and I need to then you're missing the point. What you need to do is free people. And if you free them, not only do you get results, but you get an entirely new environment. Like it's a different world. And you can see that in Asia right now. I mean, Hong Kong used to be the hub of Asia and where the most dynamic area in the financial center and it's just gone. And
all at once. It kind of
yeah,
just nobody talks about Hong Kong. China took it and it's just gone. It's and what's interesting is that when she came into office, Truss said, the whole Brexit thing is interesting. The UK separated, and one of the reasons for separation was sovereignty and the idea that Brussels was imposing all these regulations on them that they didn't really want. And one of her promises was originally, well, I'm going to get rid of all the regulations that Brussels imposed on us that we think are superfluous, which is probably a lot. And if she led with that,
the low-hanging fruit,
led instead of tax cuts, which in an environment like this and it seems like it just doesn't play well politically, even if it makes some sense economically, although the bond market doesn't think it makes any sense. But deregulation, nobody would have minded. There's no constituency to say, maybe they'd vinyl us or maybe, but there's no constituency to go out in the streets and passionately say, no, stop it, you have to resign. And yet the economic upside of freeing people up is immense. And then later on, just like Reagan, you can cut taxes or you can restructure the tax code in a productive way. She was going to do some good things like cut corporate taxes significantly, which I think is one of the, if you're going to cut taxes, corporate taxes are probably one of the better taxes to cut.
It's low-hanging fruit. It's just easy to demonize.
Yes. Yeah. But the deregulating all the European junk would have been so easy. And I think financial markets would respond positively. It would have been what they promised with Brexit. I think a constituency would respond positively. It's, but on the other hand, I'm giving political advice, so you have to be careful with that.
That's true.
These are professional politicians. You think they know this stuff, but I don't.
Well, I'm sure that politicians learn from this. Unfortunately, I'm not sure they've learned the right lessons, and I'm not even sure what the right lessons are. But this is something that I think U.S. politicians should pay real close attention to, and the jump in rates, which everyone's talking about how rates are going up so much and they're so high, and they just have very short memories. It could get much, much worse. I'm not predicting that it will. In fact, I don't think it will. But if inflation doesn't come down, then rates will have to go up a lot more than where they're currently at. And so you have a massive amount of debt having been created over the last 4 years, and just like massive numbers. COVID changed the equation completely. Any discussion of deficit reduction, any sort of restraint that usually would come from the Republican side, particularly when Democrats are in power and choosing where the spending's going, it vanished. Yeah. And so now as interest rates go up, the interest expense for the government is going to be over $1 trillion a year. And there is no cushion like we had in the early 80s, where you could, or arguably any time since then, where you could, as Republicans, go in and say, okay, we're just going to cut taxes and expect it to work economically. I don't know what will happen in the next Congress in this election. It'll probably get divided government, which would be good. So things will be pretty staid. But if we get undivided government again and people start rolling out multi-trillion-dollar tax cuts or spending bills, I think we're going to see the bond vigilantes return. And thank God there's nothing else that stops these.
Yeah, no, it was a good time in the 90s. And, you're right. I mean, the 10 years at 4.2, it could be at 8. I mean, it's not unthinkable. It's been at 8. It's been much higher than 8. And with inflation at 8, it's not shocking even right now to think of it. The expectation is still inflation's coming down, but we're yet to see it coming down. Yes, I mean, I think this might long term be good if politicians are paying attention. If they look at what's happening in the UK and they learn something from it. But we will see. I think we're going to get divided government, so we won't actually test that. But
and that's one thing we've learned, is that divided government produces better results, and it's not shocking. It
not at all.
it falls against the, if only we had a strong authoritarian who could come in and make the changes that we need, things would just be better. But it is best to have some constraints, and if it isn't the bond vigilantes, then divided government works well. And what we've seen is that together we could actually have budget surpluses, although I'm not predicting that anytime soon. Not without the solidarity.
Not at the level of deficits we're running right now. But yes, and yeah, we have to be careful of strong authoritarians for lots of reasons. We don't want to invade Canada or anything like that. So
I don't know. What are you doing this weekend? We could.
I'm invading Norway. As the case may be. All right. Good. I think we solved the problems of the world. But yes, every week we do. But yes, the solution is more freedom, and to basically the idea is to let out those ingenuous spirits so that people can experiment, try things, fail, but mostly succeed. I mean, that's the end result, right? Mostly succeed, and that's what economic growth is. It's businesses succeeding. It's businesses making profits. It's businesses growing and hiring people. That's what economic growth at the end of the day is. All right, Robert. Have a great weekend.
Thanks, Yaron. You too.
Bye.